Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I would like to give you my updated tier list for armies in competitive Warhammer 40k. I decided to make this video because there wasn't enough tournaments in March for me to make a monthly top 10 armies video, so I figured a tier list could make up for that. Also, I took a look and apparently my last tier list video was around 10 months ago, so I figured it was about time to update it. So before we hop into it, let me explain a few things that I think will help you better understand this tier list and why I placed certain armies where I did. So in my tier list, I'm going to have 4 tiers. Low tier, mid tier, high tier, and top tier. In my past lists, I believe I had 5 tiers because I had a god tier or an S tier at the top. And this was usually reserved for armies that pretty much couldn't lose to anything but other god or S tier armies. But currently, I don't think any of the armies in the game fall into that tier. And personally, I think the game is pretty well balanced at the moment. At least when considering that there are 20 plus unique armies in the game to try and balance. So because of this, I am sticking to only 4 tiers this time around. So how I decided to fit each army into each tier was based on the army's skill ceiling, meaning how well I think the army could theoretically do when built and piloted by an incredibly skilled player and when played against another incredibly skilled player. I'm going about making my list this way instead of only off of tournament results because I believe some armies just don't have enough representation with top players in order to showcase what they are truly capable of. And the last thing I want to mention is to not take this tier list too seriously, and please don't let it dictate what you build or play. Warhammer 40k is more about enjoying the hobby and building and playing and painting the army that you enjoy the most. Don't let me dictate how you enjoy the game or have fun, because as long as you practice and are better than your opponent, you should be fine. But anyways, that's basically everything I wanted to say. So now let's get into what you guys clicked on the video for, and that is my Warhammer 40k competitive armies tier list. Low tier armies, listed from best to worst: Chaos Demons, Death Watch, and Death Guard. So essentially, all 3 of these armies are suffering because of power creep. These armies' rules and stratagems are lacking when compared to other armies who have been updated within the last year through either new codexes or supplements. So these armies essentially are just in desperate need for an update. That's pretty much it. I don't think you could win a G tier major with any of these armies in the current meta, or at least what was the current meta before all tournaments in the world got cancelled. I think Chaos Demons are actually pretty decent, and probably the best out of these 3 armies, but I think their matchups in the meta are just bad right now. Marines are too good for demons and have too many counter stratagems and units that just destroy them. So that's why I put them so low, although I do think Chaos Demons could, depending on how you look at it, fit into the mid-tier armies. Also, before we move on to the mid-tier armies, I'd like to note that some Death Guard and Chaos Demon units are extremely good in Chaos Soup armies, but as solo forces, they just don't have what it takes to compete currently, at least in my opinion. For mid-tier armies, ranked from best to worst, I have Harlequins, Tyranids, Thousand Sons, Custodes, Salamanders, Black Templars, and Necrons. These armies are outshined by the armies in higher tiers because those armies do what these armies do but better. For Harlequins, Custodes, and Necrons, this is due to them not being updated for a while, but they are due for some updates sometime soon in the Psychic Awakening series, so they could change very soon. I also think that these armies have some bad matchups in the meta. For example, Necrons kinda suck against, well, pretty much everything that isn't Space Marines, and if it wasn't for that, then I'd probably put them in low tier instead. But having a good matchup against the most popular army in the game has to mean something. So they're here. Custodes kind of get shit on by Space Marines. At least they did pre-Space Marine nerf, but I assume even with the changes to doctrines, it would still be the same thing. For Thousand Sons, I think the Ahriman and Friends Supreme Command Detachment or Battalion is still incredibly good, but that's using them as allies and not really as a main force. And to be honest, that's all Thousand Sons really have going for them in my opinion. The reasons I placed them here and instead of in low tier is because I do think you can make a primarily Thousand Sons army that can still perform decently well. Mortal Wound spam is still incredibly good after all, so if you take like 6,000 Sons characters and then some screening units from other armies like Plague Burst Crawlers or stuff like that, then I think it could possibly work. And for Salamanders and Black Templars, well, other chapters have easier ways of doing similar things and winning games, but they just do it better. If you play Black Templars, then just play them as White Scars instead, or Blood Angels, or even Space Wolves. And if you play Salamanders, then just play them as a different shooting chapter, like Raven Guard or Imperial Fists. Because the rules that they get are objectively better, mainly because they're practical and they're stuff that can actually work consistently in your competitive games. Whereas stuff like the Salamander stuff really only boosts a bunch of like Flamer and Melta weapons, which are extremely short range and hard to use properly when your opponent can just either slow your unit down to stop them from getting in range with something like Tremor Shells, or they can just blow you off the board before you even get anywhere in range. And now moving on to the high tier armies. I think these armies and the top tier armies are the best armies if your goal is to try to win an event. I also think these armies and the top tier armies have the best fleshed out rules that are practical in competitive scenarios. They're all pretty straightforward and have good stratagems, spells, and damage potential. All of these armies also have builds that have topped events in the last few months. At first, I originally had all of these armies, the ones in high tier and in top tier, in the same tier. But then when I started considering some of the ones that were lower on the end versus some of the ones that were higher on the end, I thought there was just a little bit too big of a gap. Not a huge gap, but a big enough one that I think it does qualify for putting them in different tiers. But anyways, the main differences between the armies that go in high tier versus the ones that are in top tier is that I think these armies have a couple too many bad matchups, which would make it harder to go undefeated at an event, and those are usually the top tier armies. Or there is another faction that uses the same units that does their job slightly better. Not a whole ton better, like how I was saying, like for Black Templar versus Blood Angels, where Blood Angels just do everything so much better. This is more of like the difference of like White Scars versus Blood Angels, where they're both incredibly good, but one might be just slightly better than the other. So for Drukhari, as much as I would love to put them in top tier, I just don't think that they make it there anymore. For their vehicle heavy builds like Venom spam, they can kind of get shit on by Imperial Fists, or even Centurion spam, since Drukhari vehicles and infantry are pretty light and can easily be blown away by mass bolter shots. Don't get me wrong, I still think Drukhari is an incredibly good army, but I do now feel like some of the top tier armies are just slightly better. For Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum, I think they lose out to Raven Guard Centurion shenanigans and also Grey Knight shenanigans. And I think if tournaments were still a thing, then both those armies would probably still be incredibly dominant in the meta. Those armies have mass anti-infantry, enough to kill 90 guardsmen in a couple of turns. And then they can make their way after that to bad touching the tanks that were hiding in the back. For Orcs, I think they just can't deal with Space Marines. Like they can, but I think it's pretty hard. Thunderfire cannons can mess up the Orcs pretty bad, whether it's by using tremor shells or just by bombarding them and causing a bunch of casualties. Also, with Space Marines being the way they are, they have the shots and the punches to be able to deal with Orc hordes now. And again, I assume Space Marines would still be incredibly popular in the meta if they were in tournaments. And when it comes to Orc shooting armies, I think they're too random to do consistent throughout an entire event. Because I've seen a couple of games where people have had like 3 shock attack guns that just consistently roll like 4 strength and like 5 shots the entire time. And so yeah, because of that RNG factor in there, I think Orcs are a little, at least shooty Orcs are a little too RNG heavy to depend on them to win an entire tournament. For Inari, I think they're actually pretty damn good. It might even have the potential for being top tier. I just haven't really had the experience yet with the army to state that confidently. What I do know is running custom craft worlds is incredibly good, and so I'm not quite sure if it's better to run them as Inari, especially because you can still use Inari characters like the Incarn without having to change that detachment to Inari, so you can still technically use the craft world bonuses and stuff. Also, I think craft worlds might have more useful stratagems than Inari as a whole, and I think their custom craft world traits might be slightly better than Inari's power from pain, depending on how you look at it and how you build your list. And when we consider other options like Inari Drukhari, I would rather just play regular Drukhari, since for Kabalites you kinda need Agents of Ect because it's just too good, and for Witches, well, the biggest benefit for them that they would get is Power from Pain. But if you just wait until turn 3, which is kinda easy to do depending on how you play the matchup, you basically get +1 to hit on them anyways. And for Inari Harlequins, you give up advancing and shooting with your Haywire Blasters on the bikes, which in my opinion is pretty big. Moving on, we have the Ultramarines. I think they are good and could possibly be top tier, but I didn't feel comfortable putting them in the same tier as other chapters like Imperial Fists or Raven Guard, who I think just have better tools than what the Ultramarines do. Sure, Ultramarines are the best chapter when it comes to manipulating their doctrine now, but other than that, I think other chapters just have better tools. Maybe you can make an argument for Ultramarines to be at the very bottom of top tier, but personally, I don't see them beating out Raven Guard or Imperial Fists. I like the tools that those armies have much better than what Ultramarines have. With that said, Ultramarines still do have some good tools, and that's why I put them in the high tier. They have Gilliman, which is still one of the best characters in the game. And like I said previously, they're really good at manipulating their doctrine so that they can stay in it for the majority of the game and get their chapter bonus from being in the tactical doctrine. And they have stuff like the stratagem that allows them to redeploy 3 units, which can come in handy and really bait out your opponent to make some bad moves. So overall, I'd say they're pretty solid, but I still do think like Imperial Fist and Raven Guard are better, because I think deep striking in Centurions is just amazing. And I think all the stuff you can do with bolters with Imperial Fist, plus their turn 1 doctrine with artillery, it's so good for Imperial Fists. So yeah, I put Ultramarines here, and I think this is where I would keep them. Then we have the Imperial and Chaos Knights, and I think they are still decent gatekeeper armies. That means they are the gatekeepers to competitive. If you can beat them, then you can consider yourself and your army competitive. If you can't beat them, then you need to start over again with either your list or your decision making or plays in the game. Knights auto win against bad players and bad lists, but pretty much lose to good players and top tier lists. To be honest, they could be at the top of mid tier instead of at the bottom of high tier, but I chose to place them here to try and future-proof them a little bit because I'm assuming they're going to get some good buffs in Psychic Awakening pretty soon. But as of right now, I think this is where I want to put them on the tier list. They have a couple of bad matchups, mainly being like Imperial Fists, who just look at vehicles and delete them. It's not so bad now after the doctrine changes, but even still, a 6-man squad of Centurions being able to use the Mortal Wound strat from the formation can just delete a single knight in one turn. Knights also still struggle with dealing with magic boxes, but this is why you ally in some AdMech or some Astra Militarum to help them out with that. Sure, you can put some of the turrets on top of them that allow to shoot out of line of sight, but even then, it's not that many shots altogether. And it's also incredibly easy to move block knights because they can't actually walk over infantry in the movement phase. They can only do it when they're leaving combat. So you can still move block knights incredibly easily. But even with all that said, they still hit like a truck. They're still really durable, and against opponents that aren't that skilled, like I said earlier, they pretty much just auto win the game. So as long as you're a semi-skilled player, you should be able to do fairly well at a tournament with knights. And now, last but definitely not least, let's get into the top tier armies. I think these armies are currently the best in the game and will give you your best chance of winning events if you know how to pilot them correctly and are a skilled player yourself. So my top tier armies listed from best to worst are Raven Guard, Craftworlds, White Scars, Grey Knights, Imperial Fists, Iron Hands, Blood Angels, Chaos Space Marines, Dark Angels, Sisters of Battle, and Tau. So for Raven Guard, I think this is a pretty safe bet since they were dominating the meta before the Space Marine nerf. And the Space Marine nerf didn't really hit them too hard, to be honest. So I think it's safe to assume that they would still be top dog, or at least pretty damn close to it, since their biggest rival, the Iron Hands, kinda got shit on with the last Space Marine nerf. And the reasons that they are top dog is because they have a stratagem that allows them to deep strike Centurions, which is kinda nuts when you think about it, and is honestly what makes their Centurions viable. This is why we don't really see Centurions in any of the other chapters, except for maybe Imperial Fists and White Scars, but that's because the Imperial Fist one have a really good formation with them, and you can take them with heavy bolters or grav cannons, but my personal preference is the heavy bolters because it synergizes better with the Imperial Fist chapter tactic. And then for White Scars, the reason you see them is because they also have like a quote-unquote deep strike stratagem, but it's an infiltrating stratagem. They come in within 6 inches of a table edge, but more than 9 inches away from enemies, and then you can use a spell to give them +2 to charge, which makes them getting into combat pretty consistent. The whole army also gets +1 to hit and wound against characters for 2 turns of the game, which to be honest is probably a lot bigger and better than a lot of people give it credit for. Them having 3 units of eliminators, they can just nuke enemy characters within the first 3 turns of the game, and by getting rid of those characters, they're getting rid of crucial buffs, they're getting rid of crucial beat sticks, and yeah, it's incredibly good. On top of that, if they go up against something like Imperial or Chaos Knights, and those things are made into characters, then their whole army gets +1 to hit and wound against that knight, which is kinda freaking ridiculous. Same thing against like Mortarion or Magnus. Those units just die incredibly fast to Raven Guard. And then I guess the last thing that I want to mention about Raven Guard is also their Warlord trait, Master of Ambush, which allows them to infiltrate a unit before the game begins, which can create a pretty decent alpha strike, or at least get rid of a lot of the screen to make way for those deep strikes on the following turn with the Assault Centurions. It used to be better before it was nerfed when you could do this with like Grav Centurions, but now that you can't do this with Centurions at all, you can still do it with Aggressors, and then because the Aggressors technically didn't move in their turn, you can still double shoot with them and then clear a bunch of the screen, or if you wanted to, you can move them 6 inches up, 3 inches away from enemy models, and then just shoot with them regularly and then charge something and maybe tie it up in close combat. So it's still an incredibly powerful tool and can be used in a couple of different ways. For Craftworlds, I think their Shining Spears were lowered enough in points in the last chapter approved, and with the buffs that they got from Psychic Awakening, was enough to bring them back into the meta, and if the meta technically existed, because it doesn't because there's no tournaments, I think they would be dominating right now. With the right spell buffs and stratagems, that unit is capable of killing pretty much anything. Their shooting annihilates hordes, their melee annihilates elite units. They can also be deceptively durable if they get overbuffed with spells and stratagems, and if they can't get overbuffed, they can easily pull off Eldar shenanigans to keep them alive and to allow them to continue doing damage in following turns. Outside of the Shining Spears, Craftworlds have custom Craftworlds that can ignore cover and reroll a single hit and wound, which is great on stuff like Dark Reapers or Night Spinners. Between those 3 units, this army has basically everything they need to deal with the majority of the meta. Flyer spam, I think, would also still be a thing, because -2 to hit flyers are still ridiculously good, and there's only a couple armies in the game that can actually ignore those modifiers. The army is also incredibly fast and hits incredibly hard, so yeah, I think they have all the right tools in order to be a top tier army. For White Scars, they are incredibly fast, they have some cool tricks that allow them to get into combat early, and some tricks that allow them to hop from combat to combat. They are also decently durable, being Space Marines with their 3+ save, or 2+ save on certain units like Centurions, and they have ways of buffing up their damage when they do get into combat. They also have some incredibly good stratagems, like, to be fair, every Space Marine army has these, but they're really good in White Scars and Blood Angels as well, would be Honor the Chapter and Only in Death Does Duty End. These stratagems help them beat out a lot of melee armies in the game, especially because they're a little bit more durable than most melee armies in the game, and these guys can hit pretty hard as well. Once you get into turn 3 as well, you can go into the Assault Doctrine, then you start doing extra damage in melee, while also getting an extra -1 AP on all of your close combat weapons. This includes when you're just punching people with your fists. They also have some good spells, they also have the regular Space Marine arsenal to be able to pick from, and they have a ton of good units that synergize well with what they want to do. They're also incredibly good too at controlling the middle of the board, which is one thing that you'll probably notice about a lot of these armies in the top tier, is all of them are really good at kind of holding the opponent back in their deployment zone and controlling the center of the board, which I think is a huge part in ITC right now, and what kind of makes top tier armies and separates them from high tier armies, other than high tier armies also having a couple of bad matchups. For Grey Knights, they have a ton of shenanigans they can now pull off thanks to their most recent update. With enough buffs, they can make a unit of 10 paladins pretty damn close to unkillable, or they can just play like bitches and hide out of line of sight and shoot you anyways. And then when they need to, they can use the spell Gate of Infinity on that unit to just get them to where they need to be. Also, with the new ITC format, controlling the center of the board can be an easy win condition, and with 10 paladins plus a bunch of durable characters, they can be pretty damn good at doing that. With their tides that they have now too, they can do a ridiculous amount of damage in shooting with just storm bolters because of the Psi Tide and Psi Bolt ammunition, and also with the Smite Tide. I know those aren't the real names, that's just what I call them, but with the Smite Tide, you can also do a ton of mortal wounds to armies that your shooting isn't really going to do much to anyways. So the army is great at clearing hordes because of massive amount of storm bolters, they're great at clearing elite units because of the Smite Tide, and they're good against armies that hit on 4+, like Guard or Tau, because they can use their cover tide and then just stay within terrain so that the army's -1 to hit and also gains cover. There's also a cool combo that you can do where if you're in Smite Tide because you were there last turn possibly, you can then use that in your Psychic phase to get as many smites off as possible in doing all of your 2 mortal wound smites and getting a ton of damage that way. And then for your final spell, you use the spell to change the tide to the Psi Tide and then hit the enemy with all of your extra damage on your Psi weapons. It's actually an incredibly good combo, especially when done on like turn 2, turn 3, when you drop in a bunch of units and get in like a super beta strike. And with that said, the last thing I want to say about Grey Knights, it's kind of funny that they kind of went from zeros to heroes over the year, because they used to be like the worst army in the game, and now in my opinion I think they're one of the best armies in the game. And I'm pretty happy because I've had 4,000 points of Grey Knights that were collecting dust for pretty much that entire year. For Imperial Fists, I've loved their rules since they came out. Against vehicle heavy armies, it's pretty much an easy win if played right, and against everything else you can just drown them in dice with your chapter tactic. Also, ignoring cover is way better nowadays in today's meta, since cover actually ends up making a difference when playing against something like Marines who would have a 2+ in cover. A year or so ago, when people still didn't like ignore cover, that's because the meta was just a ton of bodies with shitty saves, like Guardsmen and stuff like that, so that +1 save didn't matter all that much. But in today's meta with Space Marines, having your 3+ saves count as 2+ saves is definitely something worth trying to stop, and this is why I think we see so many people moving towards traits that ignore cover. Also, it hasn't really been all that long in the grand scheme of things since Games Workshop added in that stratagem that gives your entire army cover for 1 turn if you go second, and they put that in the game to help mitigate alpha strikes. But yeah, now that every army has that option to put their whole army in cover for first turn, when you play something like Imperial Fist, you can just straight up ignore that and still get the regular alpha strike that you would have got before that stratagem got put into the game. And the last things that I want to say is that Imperial Fist's artillery is no joke. That extra -1 AP and all the long range and ignoring cover can really do a number to the opponent on turn 1 and swing the game into their favor. And also, Imperial Fist Centurions are incredibly good. I don't think I would ever play an Imperial Fist list without running a 6-man squad of Centurions. Also, the mortal wounds they can do to vehicles is absolutely nuts when you use that formation. For Iron Hands, they're still pretty solid in my opinion, even after their nerfs. You just play them like a much better Death Guard essentially. Basically, you play them as if Death Guard and Imperial Fist had a heretical baby together. Sure, the nerfs hit them pretty hard, but they still have a bunch of good tricks that they can use to win games. Just now they actually have to use their brain to win instead of just auto-winning. When it comes to Chaos Space Marines, this placement is pretty much only because of the Possessed Bomb. That's it. Chaos Space Marines, in my opinion, don't really have a whole lot going for them, and if you played Chaos Space Marines without the Possessed Bomb, I'd easily put them at the bottom of high tier or at the top of mid tier. But because of all the things you can do with the Possessed, this is another one of those armies too that can be incredibly good at taking over the center of the board and just not giving it up. Or they can just overrun their enemy and nuke them with a million attacks that do mortal wounds and 4 damage a pop, depending on the buffs that you put on them. I could be overestimating this army, but on paper, the army just looks ridiculous. And I think if tournaments were still a thing, we'd probably see more Possessed Bomb now, and I think Chaos Space Marines would consistently be a top 4, top 3 army. For Dark Angels, I've actually played against them recently, and I think they are another army that can be incredibly good at taking over the center of the board. Their vehicle list with Talon Masters and Flyers can be incredibly strong with all the aura stuff that they got going on. And they can have those units count as being in the Devastator Doctrine for 2 turns, so they can make use of their incredibly good Chapter Doctrine for 2 turns, and also the extra AP on heavy weapons for 2 turns. The army can also be incredibly mobile, and can also be -1 or -2 to hit, making them pretty damn good against shooting armies, but also melee armies, since their mobility allows them to kite the hell out of the melee armies, and their durability allows them to not just get shot off the table by the shooting armies. With their mobility as well, it's really hard for them to get alpha struck by the opponent, since they can deploy really far back on the table edge so that the opponent's turn, only their incredibly long range shooting can actually do something, and then on the Dark Angel's turn, they can just fly up, ignore the penalties for moving and shooting heavy weapons because of buffs that they have, and then they actually get the alpha strike on the opponent, even if they go second. They also have some cool tricks up their sleeve, like being able to just auto-deny a spell with I believe it's a Warlord trait or a relic. They also got buffed to have a lot of the regular Space Marine stuff too, and for the most part, Space Marines in general are just really good now. The only ones that are still kind of suffering are Death Watch, but again, that's because they've been left behind. For Sisters of Battle, they are surprisingly durable for being only toughness 3 models. A 3+ save and ignoring -1 or -2 AP can be incredibly strong from what I've seen so far. And with the way the meta would be today, or at least what I assume it would be today, people would still be spamming a bunch of like -1 and -2 AP weapons in order to try to better deal with Space Marines. So with the army being able to ignore that AP, it helps the Sisters a lot. Also, their melee units hit like tiny little freight trains. Repentias hit way harder than they rightfully should, especially when in Bloody Rose and when using the +1 to wound stratagem. Zephyrim are also pretty much the same thing, and Celestine is still one of the best characters in the game in my opinion. Super good for getting secondary points with the Postman secondary or even Born for Greatness. They also have ways of really shutting down psychic spells, so when against stuff like Grey Knights, they can absolutely just neuter their psychic phase. They also have other buffs that they can do in other matchups that allows their units to shoot on a roll of a 5+ when they die, so it's almost like Old Inari but not nearly as bad. And then of course with Miracle Dice are incredibly good since they take a lot of the RNG out of the game, and they allow you to make those critical rolls that you really need to make. And to be honest, I think Miracle Dice is probably one of the strongest mechanics in the game. And last but not least, we have Tau. Currently, I think Tau's best build is Farsight Enclave's commander spam with a giant unit of crisis suits, but I haven't really had proof of this yet, since again, tournaments aren't really a thing, and finding a good Tau player to play against on Tabletop Simulator is actually incredibly hard. But with that build that I just mentioned, I do think Tau might even deserve to be higher up on this list, maybe even top 3 armies. But that really is only going off of numbers and like what's on paper, since again, I can only speculate. I don't have any proof of this because I haven't been able to watch tournaments or look up tournament results. When it comes to their previous builds, like Triptide, I think it may be top of high tier at best, since I feel like a lot of the top tier armies can easily deal with Triptide now. It's hard to know for sure though until tournaments end up starting back up again, which I assume probably won't be until late in the year, if at all this year. And I guess with that said, that's it for my tier list. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, like whether you agree or whether you disagree with my placements. It's kind of hard to place each army right now because there are no tournaments to watch or to play in to see some of these new cool strategies, like the Farsight stuff for Tau, so I can only speculate on these things just based on numbers and my own game knowledge. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. We'll just have to wait for tournaments to start up again to find out. Anyways, that's going to be it for the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content like this in the future. Also, if you like gaming or like watching games of Warhammer 40k live, then feel free to follow me on Twitch. I stream a game of 40k every Monday at around 4 PM Eastern Standard Time, so follow the channel to be notified when I go live. I'll have a link down in the description to my Twitch channel. Also, feel free to check me out on Patreon. Patreon is what allows me to make videos like this and play Warhammer 40k full time. So if you enjoy the channel enough and the content that I make, then consider making a pledge on Patreon. I have different tiers that you can sign up for that include stuff like exclusive access to the Almost Pro Gaming Discord server, where you can get list help or tactics advice or find people to play games with on Tabletop Simulator. It's only $5 for that tier, so in my opinion, it's definitely worth it. With that said, thanks to all my current and past patrons. You guys and gals are awesome, and I can't thank you all enough. Without you, the channel would not be where it's at today. Also, thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you all stay safe and in good health, and I'll see you next time. Happy wargaming.